Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska. You can get any updates to our forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391. Get any updates to the forecast through that means as well. And you can email me at the address at the bottom of the screen, david.kramer@noaa.gov. We'll start off with a look at our fire danger. The main areas over the Yukon Delta area, a little bit down by the Kuskokwim Delta as well. And then we have another smaller area in the Yukon Flats area. Taking a look now at our satellite imagery, starting off over mainland Alaska, we can see a low pressure system moving through the kind of northern portions of northeast Alaska, bringing some cloud cover and precipitation to some of those locations. And we can see as we watch this again out by the western Aleutian Islands, low pressure moving into the area with an old frontal boundary that's pushing through the Bering Sea, starting to break down as we step forward in time here, getting sheared apart as it moves towards the Pribilof Islands and into the northern portions of the Bering Sea. And then just to the south of the Gulf of Alaska, we'll see another system down there. However, this system is moving further to the south and exiting our area, so not expecting much impacts unless people are going to be out in the southern portions of the Gulf of Alaska. Taking a look now at the weather for the remainder of the day, we'll start off west with our low pressure system by the western Aleutians, bringing rain to the western, central, and eastern Aleutian Islands with that southerly flow. That's happening behind that old frontal boundary that's breaking down now more of a trough as it pushes through the Pribilof Islands, still bringing cloud cover to the area. But as we have a ridging further to the east, extending up from the North Pacific across the Alaska Peninsula and out across the southwestern portions of mainland, not expecting much precipitation in those locations. As we push further to the north, we will see the development of fog for the Yukon Delta area. That's going to extend up further to the north and then along the Arctic coastline. This does include the St. Lawrence Island area and areas around the Seward Peninsula. We are expecting to have a mixture of rain and fog. Moving out over mainland Alaska, low pressure out over the area is helping to allow for some rain showers throughout the Brooks Range and then down through much of the central and eastern portions of the interior and as far south as the Alaska Range. South central Alaska should stay pretty dry, as well as down in the Panhandle. However, there will be some showers just to the north and east of the Panhandle. Again, our system that's just to the south of the Gulf of Alaska, we are expecting that to push to the south and not expecting that rain to come up into our area. As we move into tonight, high pressure is going to remain over the Panhandle area, keeping the area dry, and south central Alaska should also be dry under the effects of ridging that extends up from the North Pacific out over the Bristol Bay area. However, there will be some showers in some of the mountains for the eastern Alaska Range and over the Wrangell-St. Elias. Moving up further north in the mainland part of the state, we are going to see some showers throughout much of the northern interior and into the Brooks Range. But as we get along the Arctic coastline, I'm going to see a continuation of fog all along the Arctic coast down through much of the west coast through the YK Delta area, mixing with rain in the Kotzebue and Norton Sounds, and then down along the coastline of the YK Delta. With that onshore southwesterly flow that we are going to see today through tonight, for the Norton Sound area to include St. Lawrence Island, we are expecting high surf in those areas. However, not enough to result in any kind of advisory or warning, just higher than normal. That will start to weaken as we push forward in time and we see those winds weaken as well. We do have low pressure out over the southwestern portions of the Bering Sea that's going to bring rain to the Aleutian Islands out through the Alaska Peninsula and southerly flow across much of the Bering, bringing more rain to the area, including the Pribilof Islands. Moving into Wednesday, going to see multiple lows extending from the western portion of the Bering into the central and then down by the eastern Aleutian Islands, all bringing rain to the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Some of that rain is going to start to push in out over the southwestern portion of the state as our high pressure is now pushed off to the east, now extends throughout much of the Gulf of Alaska out over the Panhandle area, keeping the Panhandle dry for Wednesday as well as for much of south central Alaska. However, along the west coast with that southerly flow, we are going to see rain up all along the west coast of the state and much of the northwestern coastline as well. We'll start to see it mix with fog as we get into the Norton Sound area and areas further to the north up the coastline and all along the Arctic coastline. We'll have some lingering showers on Wednesday for the Brooks Range and the very northern portions of the interior. Then as we move into Thursday, that low pressure system is now pushed up along the west coast of the state, bringing rain well into the western portions of mainland Alaska and all along the west coast, with some more showers in the western interior and in some of the Alaska range as well. And up along the Arctic coastline, expecting to see rain showers make it up there. And behind this low pressure system, more westerly flow is coming in, bringing some lighter rain through much of the Bering to include the Pribilof Islands, and then for all of the Aleutians into the Alaska Peninsula. High pressure will still remain, however, it will be weaker out over the northern portions of the Gulf of Alaska, but still enough to keep most of south central Alaska dry as well as down in the Panhandle. Taking a look now at our temperatures for Wednesday morning, starting off in the Panhandle, temperatures dropping down to the upper 40s to lower 50s, with Yakutat getting down to 49 degrees. South central Alaska will see temperatures drop along the coastline down around 50, and then in the more interior locations, some dropping a little bit down further, down to 49 degrees for Glen Allen, Valdez, and out there by Kenai as well. Down by Kodiak City, 54 is expected low Wednesday morning. And up in the interior portion of the state, going to stay the warmest in the interior, dropping down into the lower to mid 50s. But as we extend out west and down into southwest, temperatures dropping down to the mid to upper 40s. All along the coastline, going to see much of those mid to upper 40s. Until we get up into the Norton Sound, or the Kotzebue Sound area, where temperatures will drop down into the lower 40s. Then along the Arctic coastline, going to see temperatures drop right around 40 degrees. Some locations getting a little bit colder down into the mid-30s. Utqiagvik dropping down to 34 degrees. So look out over the Aleutian Islands, temperatures dropping down into the mid-40s. With Atka and Adak both getting down to 47. Down in the Alaska Peninsula, dropping down into the lower 50s. And then up by the Pribilof Islands, upper 40s are expected, with St. Paul getting down to 49 degrees. Wednesday afternoon, temperatures getting back up to around 50 degrees for the Aleutian Islands. Warmer for St. Paul, getting up to 56 degrees. Mid to upper 50s for the Alaska Peninsula. And then into the 60s for much of the Bristol Bay area, with King Salmon getting up to 70 degrees. Those warmer temperatures around 70 degrees are going to extend up through southwest Alaska into the interior, with the lower 70s for much of the southern locations of the interior. However, as we get further to the north, going to get up into the 60s for northern locations of the interior, and colder as we get along the west coast. YK Delta getting up into the mid 50s to lower 60s. The Seward Peninsula area, mid-40s to lower 50s. And up along the Arctic coastline, temperatures getting up into the mid-40s for the furthest north locations, and in the 50s for many other locations. Dead Horse getting up to 59 degrees, warmest along the Arctic coastline. Down in south central Alaska, temperatures getting up into the 70s for most locations. A little bit cooler at Kenai, only getting up to 67 degrees. Down in the Panhandle area, temperatures getting up into the upper 60s to lower 70s. And as we move into Thursday morning for the Panhandle, dropping back down into the lower 50s, most locations. That's going to be true for the south central area as well, dropping down into those lower to mid 50s, with Talkeetna getting down to 54 degrees. In the interior, mid 50s to lower 50s, and that's going to extend down through southwest Alaska as well, with primarily lower 50s down into southwest. Up along the Seward Peninsula area, dropping down in the mid to upper 40s, and then along the Arctic coastline in the 40s for most locations. Getting colder as we get closer towards Utqiagvik, down to 34 degrees for Thursday morning. Down in the Aleutian Islands, going to drop down to the mid 40s, and then a little bit warmer for St. Paul, dropping down to 49 degrees. On Thursday, we're going to see some of our warmest temperatures. For some places in the interior, some of the warmest that we've seen for much of summer. However, we'll start off in the Aleutian Islands with temperatures getting up into the lower 50s, getting up into the mid 50s as we move to the Alaska Peninsula, into the mid to upper 50s all along southwest Alaska, with Dillingham getting up to 59 degrees. Moving up the west coast of the state, getting up into the mid 40s to mid 50s, coldest on the Kotzebue Sound side. And along the Arctic coastline, 40s in western locations, 50s in eastern locations. And then down in the interior, the warmest places in the state, we are going to get up into the upper 70s in those eastern locations, with some places getting up into the 80s. One of the only times this summer that we'll have seen 80s, even in the interior. In south central area, getting up into the mid 60s to mid 70s, warmest further inland, and then down in the panhandle, getting up into the mid 70s.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Wednesday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, we do have widespread IFR conditions with more MVFR as we get further to the east. And over much of mainland Alaska, we also have a lot of MVFR conditions with some pockets of VFR as we get in the more southern locations of the mainland and up along the Arctic coastline, with areas of IFR around the Seward Peninsula extending into northwestern portions of the interior. Then down in the Panhandle area, primarily MVFR conditions are expected, with areas of VFR further to the north. Wednesday afternoon, all of the Panhandle is going to clear up to VFR, with IFR conditions out over the Gulf of Alaska and MVFR conditions extending up along much of the North Gulf coastline, including areas around Kenai Peninsula and Kodiak Island. Much of the rest of the southern mainland is going to be VFR until we get along the west coast, where we have some MVFR conditions riding all the way up along the west coast into northern places of the interior as well, with some IFR along the western portions of the Seward Peninsula and up for the western portions of the Brooks Range. Then down in the Bering Sea and Aleutians, widespread IFR conditions are expected on Wednesday afternoon. For Thursday morning, continuing to see those IFR conditions throughout all of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, extending now into southwest Alaska through the Bristol Bay area and YK Delta areas. Some areas of isolated MVFR conditions out for some of the mainland portion of the state, especially in the mountain ranges, with VFR conditions in a lot of the low-lying areas and much of the interior. Up along the Arctic coastline, IFR and MVFR conditions are expected, and the Panhandle still primarily VFR. However, we have a lot of MVFR and IFR out over the Gulf of Alaska. Then in Thursday afternoon, continuing to see those VFR conditions for the Panhandle area, with MVFR along the North Gulf Coast, including Seward Peninsula, IFR conditions out over the Gulf, and extending into some of the areas around Kodiak Island as well. Much of the eastern portions of the mainland VFR, whereas the western portions of the mainland primarily MVFR, with IFR right along the water's edge, and some of that IFR extending into some areas of southwest and throughout much of the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline, especially the western locations of the Arctic coast. Down in the Bering Sea, widespread IFR conditions, with a mixture of MVFR and IFR for the Aleutian Islands and Alaska Peninsula. Taking a look now through the passes, starting up north at Anaktuvuk, IFR conditions improving to marginal conditions in the afternoon on Wednesday. Adigan Pass, IFR improving to marginal in the afternoon. Lake Clark and Merrill should both be VFR conditions throughout the day on Wednesday. Rainy Pass should also be VFR throughout the day, and Windy Pass should start off marginal but improve to VFR conditions in the afternoon, as well as Isabel Pass starting off marginal, improving to VFR. Mentasta should be VFR throughout the day on Wednesday, and Tanita Pass starting off marginal, improving to VFR. Portage also starting off marginal, improving to VFR conditions in the afternoon, and Chilkoot and White should both be VFR throughout the day on Wednesday. Taking a look at our freezing levels, some colder air up along the Arctic coastline around 4,000 feet out by Utqiagvik, getting up pretty quickly to 10,000 feet over northern portions of the interior. Some warmer air coming up out over the Alaska Peninsula area up to as high as around 14,000 feet near the Shumagon Islands. As we move further to the west out over the western Aleutians, going to see a little pocket of colder air down to 6,000 feet by the western Aleutians. No significant icing below 10,000 feet is expected for Wednesday. Taking a look at our jet, strongest portion of the jet out over the northern portion of the state out of the west, 115 knots. Moving around our high pressure, anywhere from 35 knots out of a northerly direction to northern locations of the Panhandle, out of a southerly direction 70 knots out of the southern locations. Then another area of stronger winds out of a westerly direction 90 knots to 110 knots by the central Aleutians. Down to 9,000 feet, flow around our low pressure out over the Bering, getting up to as high as 45 knots out over the central Aleutians out of a southwest direction. Some area of winds coming into the area, but not quite there yet, 65 knots out of the southwest, south of the eastern Aleutians. Along the west coast, southerly winds 25 to 30 knots, that includes the Alaska Peninsula and Pribilof Islands. Westerly flow over much of the northern portion of the state, 40 knots over the interior, up to as high as 65 knots over the Arctic coastline. Down to 3,000 feet, pretty similar flow, weak winds again over south central and the Panhandle areas. However, we do have an area of stronger winds south of the Gulf out of an easterly direction, 50 knots circulating around a low pressure system. But as we move up into mainland Alaska, out over the interior, westerly winds 25 knots expected. just south of the Brooks Range, extending out west by the Seward Peninsula area. Up along the Arctic coastline, southwest to west winds of 40 knots is expected. Down over the eastern portions of the Bering Sea, southerly winds 30 to 35 knots, strongest by the Alaska Peninsula, then 35 knots out of the west for the central and western Aleutians. Quite a few areas of turbulence for the central Aleutians below 3,000 feet, Alaska Peninsula and southwest Alaska below 4,000 feet, interior below 5,000 feet, and finally for the western portions of the Brooks Range below 4,000 feet.
Hello again, I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service for another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. And joining us again talking about the Augmented Reality Sandbox is Eric Stevens from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska. And he's actually talking about a project from AKwx, which is the experimental program to stimulate competitive research. A lot of acronyms, but some really fun stuff today, right, Eric?
You bet. We've got a learning tool that is a tool that's fun to use, and it really has a relevance to actually daily lives of anyone who goes outside and sees lumpy topography in Alaska. We've got a lot of mountains and such. You know, when I was younger and go on your first hike in the hills, say, you're given, maybe you're in the Boy Scouts or you get at the kiosk at the trailhead, a topographic map, a flat piece of paper with all these lines on it, bullseyes, long lines that curve back on themselves, say, perhaps things that look like this. A quadrangle or a topographic map. We've got here just to illustrate a couple of examples near Denali. Alaska has so much topography, so many mountains. And what are all these lines that we see? It can be tough to know what this means the first time you look at it. What we've got, all these lines represent lines of where the elevation of the topography goes through a certain level above sea level, say that this line represents where the mountains have gone from below 1,000 feet, mean sea level, up through 1,000 feet and above. That's your 1,000-foot contour. And when the mountain keeps going up, you're up to 1,200 feet, 1,400 feet, and so on. And that's how you get this little bullseye around the peak of a mountain.
Kind of makes layered slices, right?
Kind of like layered slices. Nice way to look at that. And when you see the lines are closer together, you're going up more steeply. If the mountain rises more slowly, it takes you longer in horizontal space to go through those different vertical increments. So
that is really hard to visualize.
Right. Imagine you're looking at a 2D piece of paper, two-dimensional piece of paper, but you're trying to understand what the three-dimensional world looks like. Well, enter the augmented reality sandbox. Yes, what is that? It is right here. We have the sandbox with us today, Sandbox 2.0, portable version. Built up at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And we've got a couple of folks helping out today.
Let's see, Alana Valaji, and she's a mechanical engineering student from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. If you want to give us a thumbs up there, Alana, thanks for helping us out today. And Courtney Breest, she's the outreach coordinator from AKwx, also helping us out today. Thanks, Courtney.
And this tool here has a Microsoft Kinect to sense the level of sand in this sandbox. And then the Kinect feeds its information into a computer that then sends a signal to a projector to draw the appropriate topographic lines on this topography. The fun thing about this, as we can see here, is that the sandbox and its Kinect and its projector, they all work as a team. So here we've got a mountain in the middle of the sandbox. What if we took down the mountain to some degree? Watch as the software responds and redraws the topography.
Kind of a caldera forming there.
There you go, And what's fun about the sandbox too is it knows that gravity flows downhill, and we've got some water that's actually down in the lowest elevations. And what's happening now is we're making it rain a little bit. We'll fill up rain into that elevated lake bed, that caldera, as you said. And so now water is pooled up there. And what if you gouged out an outlet channel?
Glacial dam release.
There you go. The water flows out. What we're seeing here is a tool that allows people to touch and connect, Microsoft Connect, RRR, to connect two-dimensional topographic maps like what we have here, these flat things on a piece of paper, to the real three-dimensional world. I think this Sandbox's real particular application as a learning tool to young people is, what does a two-dimensional map mean when it's trying to represent the three-dimensional world? This sandbox is kind of both at once. It's actually three-dimensional, lumpy topography there, the sand, but it's got these lines drawn on the three-dimensional sand that would be on a two-dimensional piece of paper.
Wow, I mean, that is a huge leap from the learning that we experienced when we were younger to how children and even adults are visualizing in these new forms of technology. Allows that to kind of reshape their thinking and visualize this in a very useful and absolutely hands-on way. It's amazing.
It's a hands-on tool, and
it's hard for me to sit here and not go play with that.
Well, that's what happened at Dehne, up at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks, when the first model was being made, the prototype with plywood and such. We had professional adult professor types had heard about this, and they came by because they wanted to see how it worked.
Okay.
And everyone becomes that idealistic, wonder-filled youngster.
Sure.
And you just can't help but play with that, and to see how it reacts in time, and it's a dynamic learning tool, and it responds.
That's exactly the word.
And you wonder what applicabilities beyond a teaching tool for topography can it have. You can see how in Alaska we have inundation mapping is an issue. If you had water slosh inland, say in a coastal flooding event on the western coast of Alaska or the Arctic coast, you could see this. The concept is illustrated here as an introductory learning method. I think this is a potentially good outreach tool for all of us in Alaska.
Okay, so not only just a topographical sense, a mapping sense, maybe something that leads into understanding of how geographic information systems work with GIS, but also geology, if we wanted to get into kind of the formations and the bigger land masses and the representation of the 2D map. We could go into hydrology, which is very important in Alaska, of course. And even just understanding the weather sense. Mounding up a big pile of sand could be that Arctic high pressure system sitting on top of Fairbanks, and the voids would be low pressure systems. This can go a lot of different directions.
Yes, exactly. It's not just landforms, but pressure has contours of high pressure and low pressure. And I wish I had this kind of a learning tool when I was taking Meteorology 101 back 25 years ago.
Wow.
Would have been helpful, I think.
Probably would have gotten a better grade. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much for coming by, Eric, and Alana and Courtney. Thank you so much for your help there in the sandbox. We are going to play in the sandbox a little bit more coming up tomorrow on our next edition of Alaska Weather Facts. We hope you join us for that. In the meantime, make sure you go to alaska.edu/EPSCOR. That's alaska.edu EPSCOR to learn more information about what we're doing with this augmented reality sandbox around Alaska. We'll see you next time on Alaska Weather Facts. And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the Marines. We'll start off with a look at our ice edge. Starting up in the Chukchi Sea, we do have a flow that's coming out of a westerly direction, pushing things off to the east. And then as we move along the Arctic coastline, we're going to have a west to southwest flow that will actually lift some of the ice further to the northeast and potentially be able to melt some of that ice out. This could temporarily clear out navigational waters along the North Slope coast by the end of the weekend, other than any ice flows that remain grounded along the coastline. Taking a look now in southeast Alaska, starting off in the inside waters, northerly winds 5 to 10 knots, and then becoming westerly 10 knots as we get further to the south. Out over the Gulf, primarily northerly winds around 10 knots, becoming westerly as we get into the northern locations. Seas only around 3 feet, pretty light winds and seas. And as we move into Thursday, flow becoming more southerly in the Gulf waters. South to southeast winds, 10 knots are expected. Seas up to as high as 5 feet on Thursday. Then in the inside waters, we do have southerly winds, 10 to 15 knots, strongest further to the south. As we move over south central Alaska, starting off in Cook Inlet, southerly winds, 15 knots are expected. Becoming westerly around the Barren Islands, 15 to 20 knots, highest on the Gulf side. Then westerly winds 10 knots as we move further to the north before becoming southerly winds around 10 knots up by Hinchinbrook Entrance. Then in Prince William Sound, westerly winds 10 knots. For Thursday, flow becoming easterly for much of the Gulf and Prince William Sound, 10 to 15 knots, getting higher as we get closer towards the Barren Islands, where we'll see southeast winds 20 to 25 knots, highest on the western side of the Barren Islands with seas as high as 8 feet. Then in Cook Inlet, easterly winds 10 knots. For Wednesday on the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, through Shelikof Strait, southwesterly winds 20 knots expected, with seas up to 6 feet. And then we'll have 15 knots out of a westerly direction on the eastern side of the island, becoming southwest 15 as we get further to the southwest. and then becoming southeasterly for the Bristol Bay area through the rest of the Alaska Peninsula. Bristol Bay only around 10 knots, getting stronger 25 to 30 knots as we get further to the west, with seas as high as 9 feet, highest on the Pacific side. Then on Thursday, flow becoming westerly for the Alaska Peninsula, 20 knots, then becoming southerly as we get further up the peninsula towards the Bristol Bay area, 25 knots. 25 knots also south of Kodiak Island. Southeasterly winds on the eastern side, 20 knots are expected, and then shoot through Shelikof Strait, easterly winds 20 knots. Seas up to as high as 10 feet, highest on the Pacific side. On Wednesday for the Aleutian Islands, starting off in the central and eastern Aleutians, south to southwest winds, 20 to 30 knots, staying at that 25 knot mark and becoming more westerly as we move by the western Aleutian Islands, with seas up to as high as 10 feet by the western Aleutians. For Thursday, flow becoming southwesterly, 20 knots for the western Aleutians, 20 to 25 knots for the central Aleutians, and becoming more westerly for the eastern Aleutians, staying around 25 knots, seas up to as high as 8 to 9 feet. Along the west coast, primarily a south to southeast wind direction, 25 knots in southern locations until we get by St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound, where winds will drop down to 15 knots. Seas around 5 to 6 feet in those southern locations. Then on Thursday, we'll see a low pressure system move through the area, and you can see the circulation around the low south of St. Lawrence Island, causing some variability in the winds, changing from northwest to east around 15 knots around that low pressure as it moves. And then in Norton Sound area, easterly winds 15 knots. And then south of Nunavik Island and by the Pribilof Island, southwesterly winds 15 to 20 knots. Up along the Arctic coastline on Wednesday, southwesterly winds 15 knots, getting stronger as we move further to the west, up to as high as 25 knots from Utqiagvik to the west, and then staying out of that south to southwesterly direction, 15 to 20 knots down the rest of the west coast. On Thursday, along the Arctic coastline, westerly winds 15 knots, becoming more variable as we drop down the west coast around 10 knots, and then through the Bering Strait area, easterly winds 15 knots are expected. For a recap of our weather, starting with tonight, low pressure out over the southwestern portions of the Bering Sea, bringing rain to the Aleutian Islands and out through much of the Bering. We'll see a mixture of rain and fog for the YK Delta area up into the Norton Sound area, and then fog up along the rest of the coastline through the Arctic coast. Some showers will remain over northern portions of the interior and to the Brooks Range, but high pressure will dominate down in the southwest and south central areas to include the Alaska Panhandle. That will all lead to drier conditions for those locations with some fog in Bristol Bay. Then on Wednesday, continuing to see high pressure out over the Gulf of Alaska, keeping south central and panhandle areas dry, but we will see rain throughout much of the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, much of the west coast, and we'll start to see some fog from the Norton Sound area further to the north, mixing with that rain up along the Arctic coastline, and some showers through the Brooks Range and northern interior. For Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.